I made a video about Bigfoot in the Middle Ages, and while I was collecting images, I was also finding art of the Cynocephaly, dog-headed people. For this video, the Cynocephaly, dog-headed race of people in art history in the Middle Ages. I'm Jenna Bosiger, and you're watching my Cryptid Cryptids YouTube channel. And if you have an interest in dogmen, wolves, or the Cynocephaly, then please hit the like for this video, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I really do appreciate it. Art history gives an interesting perspective, especially before photography, because it includes visual accounts of important events and people. So I did my best to collect only art from the Middle Ages, which started with the fall of the Roman Empire around 500 AD and ended with the start of the Renaissance around 1500. And just to keep it in context, let's take a look at this well-known painting of dogs playing poker. So Wikipedia says the first time this was painted was in 1894. But without knowing that, you could be certain that a painting like this wouldn't have been done in the Middle Ages unless there was some truth to it, because in art history, that kind of thinking and conceptualization and humor in art didn't happen until maybe around sometime after the Impressionist art movement. So while not all of the paintings from the Middle Ages are real and true, the artists at that time were painting realistic, important events and important people. And even if the stories weren't true, they were painting the stories realistically, as if they were true. And back then, there was really only representational art. The most often painted dog-headed man was Saint Christopher from the biblical land of Canaan. And just a side note about the land of Canaan, it no longer exists, and whoever lived there when it was called Canaan lost the land because they were attacked and their land was taken. And now that land is one of the most hotly disputed territories maybe in all of the world that is still being fought over today. With the wars being fought over that territory, what chance would a dog-headed species have had to have kept sovereignty over that land? If they were there first, they did not stand a chance. There are so many paintings of Saint Christopher from so many different places, and they all depict him as having a dog head. Even his life story details problems about him having a dog head and not fitting in with the judgmental, inquisitory nature of the Christians from the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages also includes the Inquisition. The members of his same religion he chose to follow and devote his life to would eventually betray him by cutting off his head. St. Christopher had a meaningful encounter with Jesus when he was helping people cross a raging river. Because of his size and strength, he was able to carry people across with ease, but when he carried Jesus on his shoulders, he struggled with the weight of the child, and he had to use all of his strength to get across the river safely. And when they had crossed, he asked Jesus why, and Jesus answered, because he had the weight of the world on his shoulders. And that is how the name Christopher originated and was first given to the dog-headed man, whose real name is hard to pronounce. But it stands for the time he carried Christopher, the water. Jesus was fond of the dog-headed species and of St. Christopher, the dog-headed man. And it was the same type of people that betrayed Jesus that also betrayed St. Christopher. So instead of assuming that the dogmen are demons just because of the way they look, let's be clear that Jesus was a friend to the dog-headed men. Maybe think twice before assuming that they're all demons. So back then, as artists, you weren't allowed to just paint a saint with the face of a dog. That would not have been allowed. Back then, art was painted realistically of important religious people and biblical events and eventually stories. And the biblical events may have been fantastical, but they were painted realistically. Art movements like abstract art and surrealism or even comics hadn't happened yet. If you were an artist hired by the church to paint a saint, even if the saint looked like a dog, you couldn't literally paint him with a dog's head. You would have been in big trouble. That would only have happened if it was his true appearance, and if everyone who saw him in person described him that way, because everyone from Greece to the Middle East to Europe All different artists, all at different times of his life, they all painted him with a dog's head. And not just any dog's head, but the same type of dog's head, the same color, the same dog, the same person painted over time. You can tell how people felt about the dog-headed men by the accounts of some of the people who first saw them, like Marco Polo, who described them as barbaric cannibals. And in his travel to the Andaman Islands, he said that they were a people without a king, and he considered them no better than the wild beasts. The first known written account of these creatures was by the Greek physician Cyzius in the 5th century BC. Around this time, the physician returned to Greece from India with detailed passages of his travels and the Cynocephaly. And in short, he described a civilization of roughly 120,000 dog-headed, dark-skinned men and women. He called them swarthy with long tails, living in the lofty and inaccessible mountains in India. And he said that their teeth were larger than those of dogs and their nails were long, and that though he heard no language, he claimed they barked like dogs and were thus understood by each other. He also said that they slept on leaves or grass in mountain caves and could live to be up to 200 years old. And to quote his notes, it says, "They are extremely just like the rest of the Indians with whom they associate." He said they understood the Indian language but were unable to converse with them, only barking or making signs with their hands and fingers to reply. He added that the women bathed monthly and the men not at all, with the exception of their hands. Herodotus traveled to the eastern region of Libya and described the nomads who lived there. He said it was exceedingly mountainous and wooded and full of wild beasts, naming the Cynocephaly among many others. When he described the Cynocephaly, he said they were upright and would injure no man, and that they had no speech, however, that they would howl and understood the Indian language. He claimed that wild animals were their food and that they could catch them with ease, exposing them to the sun's heat to cook them after shredding them into pieces. Claudius Aelian also noted that their whole body was covered in hair and that the regions where they lived were so inaccessible it was very hard to capture them. A few decades later, Alexander the Great, or rather Alexander the Terrible, invaded India, and he too claimed in his letters to his famous philosopher teacher Aristotle that he had seen a cynocephaly. He even claimed that he had caught some and described them as fierce, vicious, barking, snarling beasts, and this he wrote in a letter that he sent to his buddy Aristotle. For about 1,500 years following the original accounts of the cynocephaly, many explorers, conquerors, and even Christian missionaries claim to have seen and interacted with the dog-headed people. There are accounts that even King Arthur and his army defeated a band of dog-headed soldiers in the mountains surrounding Edinburgh, Scotland. One Italian traveler of the 13th century told an encounter between armies of Khan and dog-headed people near Lake Baikal in what is now Russia. He said the monsters had men's heads but dogs' faces. And he said they spoke in words that were more like the barking of a dog. And a lesser-known account of a cynocephaly was of that of a Christian theologian, Ratramnus. One of his monks asked him, "What do I do when I encounter the dogheads? Can I save their souls? Can I preach to them? Or do I look at them as animals?" He also noted that their speech was inarticulate, unintelligible, and not that of man, clearly claiming that they were beasts. Ratramnus was concerned, and he consulted his elder in a letter on the dog-headed creatures, in which he tries to persuade his superior that the dog-heads were in fact sons of Adam, and that they should be allowed to convert to Christianity and not be treated as animals. In another account, the Dominican friar Vincent of Beauvois noted that the cynocephaly was an animal with the head of a dog, but in all other means would behave like a man, and thus when peaceful he would be tender like a man, but when furious would become cruel and could retaliate on humankind. Ratramnus argued that because Rimbert's sources describe the cynocephaly as living in villages and engaging in agriculture and crafts, that they must be rational and therefore human. He wasn't bothering to answer whether or not they were real. He was arguing whether or not they could be converted because he already knew they were real. That question had already been answered, or he wouldn't have jumped to trying to convert them. I decided to alternate between art history and the truth, the facts as we know them today. For example, wolves hunted to extinction in France. Wolves hunted to extinction in Britain. Wolves hunted to extinction in Europe. Wolves hunted to extinction in Germany. Wolves hunted to extinction in Scotland. Wolves hunted to extinction. Should I name all the gray states? Do we have time for that, really? Or can we just look at this and compare the gray area where the wolves were before we hunted them to extinction to the orange areas where they live now? I'm going to say that orange looks like about 8% of the gray, and that means that we've killed 94% of the wolves in the United States, and people are pushing for 100, and judging by history, they will achieve it soon. This I'm getting from the extermination of Northern Europe's wolves first became an organized effort during the Middle Ages and continued into the late 1800s. In England, wolf persecution was enforced by legislation, and the last wolf was killed in the early 16th century. Wolves survived a little longer in Scotland, where they were sheltered in vast tracts of forest, which were subsequently burnt down. Wolves managed to survive in the forests of Braemar and Sutherland until 1684, and the extirpation of wolves in Ireland followed in a similar course, with the last wolf believed to have been killed in 1786. A wolf bounty was introduced in Sweden in 1647 after the extermination of moose and reindeer forced wolves to feed on livestock. The Sami extirpated wolves in northern Sweden in organized drives, and by 1960, few wolves remained in Sweden due to the use of snowmobiles hunting them down, with the last wolf being killed in 1966. The gray wolf was exterminated in Denmark in 1772, and Norway's last wolf was killed in 1973. The species was almost wiped out from Russia. The gray wolf was present only in the eastern and northern parts of Finland by the 1900s. And at the beginning of 2016, the wolf population was roughly 300 individuals. In Central Europe, wolves were dramatically reduced in numbers during the 19th century. In Bavaria, the last wolf was killed in 1847. And had disappeared from the Rhine regions by 1899, and largely disappeared from Switzerland before the end of the 19th century. And in 1934, when I read In 1934, Nazi Germany introduced the first legislation regulating the protection of wolves. And then it goes on to say the last free living wolf was to be killed on the soil of present-day Germany in 1904. Between 800 and 813, France established a special corps of wolf hunters. This was abolished after the French Revolution in 1789, but was re-established in 1814. And in 1883, up to 1,386 wolves were killed, many more by poison. Wolves were extirpated in Slovakia during the first decade of the 20th century, and by mid-20th century could only be found in a few forested areas in eastern Poland. Wolf populations in Romania, with an average of 3,000 wolves being killed annually. An all-time low was reached in 1967, and the extirpation of wolves in Bulgaria was relatively recent, as a previous population of 1,000 animals in 1955 was reduced to about 100 in 1964. Greece, species was hunted to extinction. Organized persecution of wolves began in Yugoslavia in 1923 with the setting up of the Wolf Extermination Committee in Slovenia. 30,000 wolves were harvested annually from a population of 200,000 during the 1940s, with 40,000 to 50,000 hunted during peak years. Soviet wolf populations reached a low around 1970, disappearing over much of the Eurasian Russia. Is it any wonder how a dog-headed species would have gotten along in the Middle Ages? That's going to do it for this episode, and if you have an interest in wolves, please hit the like for this video, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I really do appreciate it. And until next time, bye!